Many of us gathered yesterday right outside this church to celebrate Medfield Day. It was an amazing community event, featured live music, food vendors, crafts, games, and seemingly everyone from Eastern Massachusetts. And our church, right out front here, offered several fabulous activities. There was pumpkin painting, henna tattoos, there was tours of the historical bell tower, a petition for a ballot initiative calling for ranked choice voting, ticket sales for Espresso Yourself, and information on the upcoming climate strike. And at one of our first parish tables, people were invited to respond to the question, what do you love? And what do you hope to never lose due to the climate crisis? People of all ages were invited to think deeply about this question, and they wrote the responses on these ribbons that you see above your heads today. Let us this morning honor these hopes, these dreams, and yes, even these fears that our neighbors in the greater community expressed. For truly, when it comes to taking care of the environment, we are all in this together. Come, let us worship. O Spirit of all that is good in the world, we ask for you to be with us this morning as we enter into this time of prayer and meditation. Let us breathe in the warmth and the light. Breathe out any pain you may be feeling. Breathe in your most true and best self. Breathe out all that might keep you stuck. I invite you to listen to your breath, knowing that you are surrounded by the infinite love of the world and all of us who call this place home. Let us now enter into a time of silent reflection and meditation. Our reading this morning comes from Genesis 7, 17 through 23. The flood continued 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters swelled and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. The waters swelled so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters swelled above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And all flesh died and moved on the earth, all birds, domestic animals, wild animals, all swarming creatures that swam on the earth, and all human beings. Everything on dry land whose nostrils was the breath of life died. God blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, human beings and animals and creeping things and birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark. A few weeks ago, around the dinner table, my family and I were talking about the latest news. I'm sure some of you heard the news that much of the Amazon rainforest was on fire. Now, many of you remember the reporting that this was not caused by some natural disaster, this wasn't caused by lightning, but most of these fires were intentionally lit by livestock farmers who wanted to clear the land so that they could produce meat. These fires caused an uproar from the world community, because the Amazon rainforest, they say, is essentially the lungs of our planet. Breathing in the greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, and breathing out that life-giving thing we all require, oxygen. But to compound the problem, these cattle that these farmers are raising, they produce large amounts of methane from their manure. And according to the UN's Department of Economic and Social Affairs report that was released just in 2007, methane's effect on global warming is 28 times higher than carbon dioxide. Well, as we sat around the dinner table that night, Lila, our 9-year-old, she needed some help understanding why we grown-ups were doing this. My wife and I, we tried to explain that beef farmers, they need to make money. And that, unfortunately, the leaders of South America were right now looking the other way at this practice. We explained how, each country can make their own laws and they can choose to enforce them or not. She looked at us and she sort of understood, maybe. Maya, during this time, our 14-year-old, she was mostly quiet. She listened, she ate her dinner, and she excused herself to go do homework. Well, after we all finished eating and we cleared our plates, I found Maya a few minutes later. She was on her bed. She was sobbing. I didn't know what the problem was. I thought she was hurt. She wouldn't tell us. Minutes went by. She wouldn't tell us why she couldn't stop crying. Finally, she turned to me with tears in her eyes and she just yelled, "No one even cares." I think anyone who has a child can understand that feeling of when your child is hurting. This is the same girl who 4 years ago, after learning about composting by her fabulous science teacher, she declared that we as a family were going to compost. And she would be the one to empty the compost bucket every week. It's mostly worked out. And this is the girl who 2 years ago, after learning in her science class about the climate crisis and how we here in the developed world are largely to blame due to our outsized energy consumption, she declared, "We are not going to have the lights on in any room in which we're not currently in." But that optimism that she displayed as a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, it's now been replaced with angry tears. No one even cares. No one even cares. I certainly can understand why she would think that. Because even those of us adults who do care deeply about the climate crisis, those of us who do everything we can to protect the environment, we've all had to make compromises over the years. We may want to heal the world, but we also need to figure out how to get to work, how to heat our homes, how to light our houses. Our many years of living in the adult world have taught us that we need, by definition, to balance our aspirations with the reality of the world we're living in. But many of our children don't have such a complicated view of things. If climate scientists have concluded that our pollution is causing climate change, stop polluting. If plastic is killing marine life in our oceans, stop using plastic. If eating meat increases harmful methane in our atmosphere, stop eating meat. Plain and simple, right? But listen, before we criticize our young for being overly passionate or unrealistic in their expectations, I invite you to try to remember what it felt like when you were 14 years old. Who here remembers those formative moments in your life when you first came of age? When you first started to understand a little bit about that great big world you were about to head into. Maybe you too didn't like everything you saw. Perhaps you were coming of age during the Great Depression, and you realized that you had to save every little thing that you got your hands on, because food, a home, a job was not guaranteed. Perhaps some of you were coming of age during the Vietnam War, and you knew that you soon too might be called up to serve your country in a war that was unwinnable. A war that the grown-ups had started, and that you soon might be asked to die for. Perhaps you were coming of age, and in those first moments, you started to realize that you were attracted to people of the same gender. You started to wonder if the world was going to be such a friendly place for you. These moments when we're coming of age, they define who we are and who we will become. And for this generation in 2019, this generation of young people, the climate crisis is shaping who they are. That fear that they have is very real. And we, as their parents, as their grandparents, we as the adults of the world, we need to realize that that fear is not coming from some wild, youthful fantasy. It is actually rooted in decades and decades of peer-reviewed, well-established climate science. And as some have tried to claim, climate crisis is not a matter of belief. It never was. Climate crisis is fact. It is happening now. We caused it. Generations of industry dumping garbage into our environment has finally caught up with us. We can't get away from it, and our children are demanding that we own up to this, that we take responsibility and we do something about it. They say no one even cares. Well, the good news is that here at First Parish, I think we do care. After all, we are a UUA certified green sanctuary. Many of us here will be marching on the global climate strike in the Boston Common this coming Friday, September 20th, and we hope to join us. You may be aware of these climate strikes. They were originally created by a Swedish 16-year-old girl named Greta Thunberg. She describes learning about the climate crisis in school as a young person and feeling like the leaders of the world were not taking this crisis seriously enough. She began leading these youth strikes to raise awareness and to hold politicians accountable for their lack of action. And as she said in Davos last year at the World Economic Forum, adults keep saying, we owe it to the young people to give them hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day, and then I want you to act. I want you to act as if your house is on fire, because it is. Now, of course, you may hear that her message has not been received well by many. I've read many articles that declare that this young person doesn't know what she's saying. She's too young to understand, that she's simply inciting panic, that she should just go back to school, keep quiet, that she's just another overly zealous, emotional doomsayer. But she, like many others, know that the flood is coming. Just ask the people in New Orleans after Katrina. Ask those along the coast of New Jersey after Superstorm Sandy. Ask those in Puerto Rico after Maria. Ask those in the Bahamas who were just killed in Hurricane Dorian, if this is some manufactured fantasy. From our reading this morning, we heard of another great flood, the story of Noah's Ark from the Hebrew Scriptures. This story is, of course, thousands of years old, one that many of us learned when we were a child. And as a lifelong UU, I was never taught that this story was literally true, but that it was meant to be taken metaphorically. However, there is considerable historical evidence that there was, in fact, a major flood in the ancient Near East. Scholars have found documents of great flood stories throughout that region. So it does seem that this story was, in fact, inspired by a real event. I wonder how someone living 3,000 years ago would have made sense of such an enormous natural disaster. Without our modern scientific tools and understandings of meteorology, how would they have come to understand what was happening? As it's described in Genesis 17, the waters swelled so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heavens were covered. The waters swelled above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And in the end, only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark. When I hear this story, I try to imagine what it must have felt like for Noah and his family as they floated for days and days inside that ark. What was going on in their minds? Could they sleep at night? Were they scared? Did they think that they soon would be next to die? But the only thing that was saving them in that moment from this surrounding destruction that was killing everything around their ark was this simple wooden boat. Now listen, if we look at the original text, the Hebrew word that was used for the ark was tabah, meaning a vessel or a basket. And the only other time in Hebrew scriptures that we find this word tabah is in the story of the baby Moses, who escaped the wrath of the Pharaoh in the book of Exodus. You may recall, at least those of you who went to Sunday school or CCD or something else, that Moses' mother placed her baby in a small basket to send him down the river so that her child would not be killed. In both instances, tabah is being used to describe this holy vessel. This vessel that's transporting people through waters of darkness and despair. One family would go on to rebuild humanity. The other would lead the Hebrew people out of bondage to develop their own society. But it's the tabah that gets them there, that gets them through that dark night. So I ask you today, in 2019, as we face our own environmental crisis, where is our holy tabah? What will get us through our great flood? Will we, like Noah, ever see that dove carrying that olive branch? Sign of hope. What the future holds for our blue and green home is very much uncertain right now, though we know that the coming years and decades will not be easy. But I ask you to remember the most important part of that story of Noah. God did not build that ark. Despite the naysayers who told them that everything would be fine, despite Noah's neighbors that told him to just calm down and go about their business, Noah and his family built that tabah with their very own hands. In the face of disaster, they rolled up their sleeves and they got to work and they did something. And as Unitarian Universalists, let us remember the example of Noah. For we are a faith that has always valued our deeds over our creeds. We may all have different beliefs about the bigger questions of life, the mystery of the universe, but what has always connected us is the conviction that our actions here, now, are what truly matter. I'll tell you, if there was ever a time in our history when actions mattered more, can't remember one. So to my daughters and to all the children of the world, let us say that we, the adults of the world, we take responsibility for our mistakes. We do care. And we pledge to do better. Amen. And as we prepare to go out into the world, let us hold in our hearts the aspirations, the fears, the dreams of the words written on these ribbons above our heads. Whether we personally are able to attend the global climate strike that corresponds with the meeting of the United Nations Climate Council, know that these ribbons and all that they represent will hold vigil here at First Parish until the climate strike ends on September 27th. Let us also remember the words of Rabbi Tarfon as written in the Talmud. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. So may it be.